Thank you very much, dear friends. Once again, I would like to welcome you at our first episode this year. As you've seen, we changed our format a bit. Now we invite a couple of guests to come to our virtual studio because we would like to get absolutely different perspectives, competences, and experience that would be interesting for you. We will also be live once per 2 months. And as you've already probably noticed, we want to expand our audience and to involve as many professionals as possible. And that is why we now offer you simultaneous interpretation into the English language. So we warmly welcome our Russian and English-speaking audience. Our episode is being recorded and it will be available in Russian and in English for those who couldn't join today. And now, very briefly on the topic of today's session. Today we'll talk about the space traffic. This is a very popular topic, especially when it comes to space traffic management. We are also quite familiar with that. We've been dealing with this for over 5 years, and now it is actually in the competence of the UN Committee on the Space and its Legal Subcommittee. What's interesting, the issue of the space traffic was included to the agenda after a symposium on that topic was held. The symposium for the delegates of the Legal Subcommittee, and it was organized by the European Center for Space Law as well as the other organizations. And many of the representatives of these bodies joining us today, and this is an input of the representatives of NGO to the development of space law. We will touch upon this topic in a bit later. And now I would like to get back to the topic of space traffic. If we take a look at those discussions that are conducted in the UN Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, etc., then perhaps it's a bit early to take about a consensus in the field of space traffic. There are some guiding principles on or at national levels, but when it comes to international platforms, there is more and more discussion about the coordination of space traffic as well as the exchange of information to understand what is going on in the space. Well, by and large, the space safety is a very important aspect for the sustainable space activities, and the beneficiaries of it will be not only states, but also us as the end users of a lot of space tools and space products. Today, we would like to touch upon the norms of the space traffic. Are there enough norms or would we require some other ones? What are the prospects in the developing of this aspect? And for this discussion today, we invited wonderful guests, very seasoned people with a very extensive field experience in the field of space. I would like to introduce Vladimir Agapov, the general designer of joint stock company Astronomical Scientific Center, a full member of the International Academy of Astronautics and a member of the IAA Board of Trustees for Engineering Sciences. He sits in a number of committees, such as those who are dealing with space debris and space traffic management. And he is also a member of the International Astronautical Federation committees on space traffic management and space security. Our next guest is Alexander Sunserv, Deputy Head of the Department of International Law at the RUDN University. International space law is one of the key areas of his scientific interests and research. He is a member of the working group of the Interparliamentary Assembly of the Commonwealth of Independent States on the preparation of the CIS Convention on cooperation in the exploration and use of outer space for peaceful purposes. This convention entered into force in 2019. And Alexander also participates in the activity of the International Institute of Space Law and the European Center for Space Law. And our next guest is Valentin Uvarov, the CEO of the Climate Monitoring Systems LLC. In his scientific research, he focuses on a very popular topic now, which is the active debris remediation and development of a comprehensive system for monitoring greenhouse gases based on remote sensing data. He is also a member of the Space Council of the Russian Academy of Sciences and the International Institute of Space Law. His track record includes holding leadership positions with the Russian United Rocket and Space Corporation and the Center for Industrial Communications of Roscosmos Top Research Institute SNI Mash. So, dear guests, thank you very much for finding your time and being with us today. Thank you for being ready to share your experience. Our participants can pose questions to our guests. It's better to do in the Q&A section, and we will discuss these questions at the end of our session. Today, Maxim Alexeyev and Yaroslav Vasanin are helping us with this, and my name is Anna, and I'll be interpreting for you today. So, dear colleagues, perhaps it's better to discuss theory and practice, proceeding from some specific cases. In the December of last year, China approached the UN General Secretary and delivered the information on some non-safe approaches of Starlink satellites. This is a constellation of SpaceX. So SpaceX satellites were coming too close, as they believed, to Chinese satellites. And China referred to the Outer Space Treaty item, where it says that the states should inform each other on any dangers in the outer space that pose a risk to cosmonauts, astronauts, and other representatives of other states. In this case, China believed that it was a danger for those who were at the Chinese station. And so this station is about from 400,000 kilometers from the Earth, and Starlink satellites were at the distance of about 550,000 kilometers. And so the situation was explained as follows. The Starlink satellites had to be removed from the orbit by SpaceX company because they've already been out of date. And what's interesting, China asked the UN General Secretary to pay attention to the fact that in accordance with the Outer Space Treaty, states and countries are responsible for the space activities of both governmental bodies as well as private companies. And so now let's identify from which framework should we proceed here. From which legal framework? Alexander, I believe this should be the question to you. Could you please share with us which norms could be used here in this particular case? Can we presume that any of the states in this case violated or somehow didn't deliver on their requirements or liabilities when it comes to the Outer Space Treaty? Can we say that the principle of cooperation and mutual assistance was observed or non-observed here? Perhaps there should be a mechanism of preliminary consultations launched in this respect. And it would also be very interesting for me to understand. In this particular case, no incident or accident took place, no collision took place, but if it did, what would be the legal consequences? Could we refer to the liability convention that also prescribes that the damage should be reimbursed? If we talk about the situation in the outer space when somebody can be blamed for this, can we characterize the situation as if one of the parties of this situation was liable for that? Good afternoon, dear colleagues. Thank you very much for inviting me here. First and foremost, I'd like to mention a couple of things because we are discussing a very comprehensive issue. First, I'd like to say that, well, the number of satellites is indeed increasing dynamically. Just a couple of figures. In 2019, 600, and in 2021, we already have 1,800 satellites. So it's a 3-time growth. And we do understand that the more satellites we have, the more risks we can face. Well, this is indeed a challenge for us. Secondly, this is not a very rare case. Well, of course, here we are talking about the Chinese satellite station, but if we talk about the World Space Station, well, we see some news that are coming that our system identifies some unsafe approaching and has to change its trajectory at least twice per month. This is the statistics from the Russian space agency Roscosmos. And indeed, this is a dynamic that persists. And thirdly, I would also like to mention that despite the fact that we are living in a very interesting time, still there is no legal framework. And well, perhaps we could draw some parallel with the framework in the field of air traffic. Also, when it was introduced, I mean, when the air traffic was introduced, there were no regulations. But when one collision took place, then another one, and as a result, we've got the Chicago Convention. And so today we see that indeed we need to organize the legal norms in the space activity in such a form that we could also proceed with a very specific framework. And so you mentioned the note or the letter from China that was sent on the 3rd of December 2021. But when I was getting prepared for this session today, I actually found a letter from the US that was a response. And so in the Chinese letter, there is one picture of what happened, and in the American letter, there's another explanation of what happened. And I believe that indeed this is a very interesting topic, and we decided to even write a joint article together with my colleague. Indeed, what you mentioned, the Outer Space Treaty, Article 9, which says that countries should cooperate here, taking into account the mutual interests of all the players in the outer space law. And, well, of course, when it comes to the due regard concept, what is it about? What does this concept include? Because, well, we do have some interpretation for that, but the question is, in which areas should we cooperate in due regard and to what extent? And of course, everybody enjoys the freedom in the outer space, but as we know, the freedom of our activities is limited by the freedom of other people and players. And so China says that there was an unsafe approaching of the space objects twice in July and in December. So the question is whether the US respected the liabilities that were placed on them before. And I would like to cite and quote the letter from China. So it says that there was a satellite that was maneuvering without any particular target continuously. If we take a look at the position of China, then we should refer to the Article 6 of the Outer Space Treaty, which is about reimbursement of damage. And here we also could refer to the Liability Convention, Article 3, which is about remediating damage that takes place beyond the surface of Earth. So here, no damage was incurred. And if we take a look at the letter from the US, then it says that from 2014, they've been exchanging information with China, and China hasn't notified them about anything. And the US considers this event as a safe event. And so the question here is, where does the risk start? What is an unsafe behavior? What is an unsafe approaching? Well, for example, China says that 382 kilometers is an unsafe approaching activity. And the US says that, well, that was about 390 kilometers. And so the difference here is in the 8 kilometers. And so different parties here refer to different documents. The US believes that this was a safe event and an approaching, and China believes that it was an unsafe approaching. And so, as you've said in the beginning, Elina, of course, we need to establish a unified understanding, a unified framework of information exchange in this respect, because space safety should take a priority here, indeed. That was briefly my short comment. Yes, thank you very much for your comment. Indeed, you touched upon a very different issue of different assessment of a situation. Vladimir, you have an extensive practical experience. Well, this case that we are considering, can it be so that different operators interpret safe and unsafe distances differently, and so they come to different conclusions in this respect? Are there any unified standards? Because we do know that there is no unified framework. Are there any unified standards or common practices? How do operators address these issues between one another? Dear participants, dear colleagues, good afternoon, good evening. I'm very thankful for the invitation to take part in this discussion. Well, firstly, I would like to underline that the space safety is a very difficult and comprehensive substance, essence, and there are multiple aspects that could influence the assessment of it. In addition to that, and taking into account the outlooks of different players in the space activities, well, safety is not an absolute concept, and it depends on our visions a lot. I'll explain. For example, let's imagine you are a driver and you're moving along a highway with a speed of 150 kilometers per hour. And you are surrounded by numerous vehicles, and you can see them in the mirrors, in the rear mirrors, etc., or perhaps with some other tools. And you do see that all the other subjects on the road coordinate their behaviors with the traffic situation. And subjectively, you believe that you are safe because, well, you see what is going on and you believe that you assess the situation properly. And Well, here we need to take into account the number of objects that are moving, the speed with which you're moving, etc. Okay, that was safe. But let's just imagine that all this takes place in a fog, and immediately you don't feel safe anymore because you don't receive an objective information from your point of view. You don't understand what is going on. And this is the second aspect of safety, which is connected to the reliability of information. What is reliability? This is about your trust to the information that you should use to make decisions in some critical situations. Just as an example, well, perhaps still this more of a fantasy of mine, but in this particular case, the American side provided some kind of information that indeed there was a satellite was supposed to come closer to the Chinese satellite. And the other side, for some reason, doesn't trust the first side. And in this case, the Chinese side isn't ready to use this information to make decision on whether one needs to maneuver or move the satellite or not. So the question of trust, the issue of trust, proceeds from the deep knowledge about the information that we will use. And here we touch upon the issues on the necessity to manage and coordinate the space traffic. If we compare it with the road traffic, when we get the information around or about the objects that are next to us, unlike here, when it comes to assessing a situation in the future, this is not something that will happen in a couple of seconds. This is something that will happen in a day or in a couple of days. Here, we need to use a very complex set of models. This set will allow us to describe the situation that will take place in the space with some kind of precision. We will never be able to describe it all and forecast it all with an absolute accuracy and precision. What it means? It means that any information that we use here still lacks some accuracy and precision. And proceeding from what we trust in, then we will use this information for some decision making or not. What I mean is, for example, if the distance between a space station and some object was 8 kilometers and somebody believes that this is not safe, okay, I can tell you the following. If there is no additional data, if there is just a claim, a notification that in, for example, 24 hours, the minimum distance between two space objects will be 8 kilometers. For me, as a professional in this respect, well, this is not a very precise information, because if they say that the assessment is 8 kilometers and the precision rate or the possibility of error here is about 100 meters. So it can be either 8 kilometers and 100 meters or 7 kilometers and 900 meters, then that's okay. It's not a problem for me. But I need to get the context and I need to understand how this information was received and was collected. And for example, just imagine if they say that the assessed distance between two space objects is 8 kilometers, and if they say that, well, you know, the mistake could be here like 50 kilometers, then of course this doesn't make sense at all for me. And sometimes, or almost always, we can't make a decision here. And the most proper action here would be not to do anything, because we see that the assessment is also quite ambiguous here. So the assessment and the probability are very important aspects here. And there's another very important aspect, which is about the timely notification. Those are the cornerstones that could serve as problems when it comes to establishing a unified legal framework or set of norms and rules on how to conduct safe activities in this space. And another aspect that I would like to mention is about the development of new satellite systems, such as Starlink, for example. This is an aspect that is connected to the notion of the object of safety and subject of safety. Because traditionally and historically, when it comes to our fundamental treatise on space, object is a material and physical object, as well as human lives in the outer space or on Earth. And subjects here are traditionally countries and states that are responsible for space activities. Because of the development of the technologies, as well as the increased intelligence of satellites and space objects, this correlation between object and subject has changed, because currently the space vehicles, the satellites, are becoming so smart that sometimes they can make a decision without the participation of a human being. This is quite similar to artificial intelligence, and in future we need to take that into account. So formally speaking, the space treaties establish that a specific legal entity within the jurisdiction of a country or some intergovernmental or international organization is responsible for some particular activities. But we should not forget that a satellite, a space vehicle, can also become more of a subject within these deliberations. I don't think that we studied this issue enough. Nobody understands how to work with this within the legal framework. And in my opinion, to just say that, currently we have the exchange of information, somebody sends data, somebody receives or doesn't receive data, we do understand why this is happening, this ambiguity is happening, because we haven't agreed on the main framework, on the main elements. First, this is about the timely notification. And secondly, as I've said, this is about the correlation between object and subject relations in the outer space. Well, I believe that the cornerstones and issues that you mentioned indeed can explain to us why we see some success when it comes to the national level of space activities, and there is no success at the international level of space activities. Because if a state or a country acts in the outer space, then they can establish their own rules and procedures. When it comes to NASA and SpaceX, we do know that there are some agreements and treaties on that. We do know that 2 Americans agreed on how to behave in the outer space. They agreed that Starlink satellites will avoid the objects that NASA launches in case of any risk. This is also an option. This could be in addition to the space safety. But in this respect, if we do everything at the national level, then the system that we'll get will be very fragmented. Because if we act only at the national level and establish the framework only at the national level, it doesn't result in the international unified space. So we can resolve issues between the operators of the same country, but cannot do it between the operators of different countries. So while everybody is trying to understand how to proceed further, my question is, what operators from different countries should do in this respect, Valentin? Yes, good evening, good afternoon, dear colleagues. I would also like to thank for inviting me to take part in this event. And so from my side, from my point of view, I'd like to say that, Elina, you are absolutely right saying that at the national level, there are indeed some developments, some positive developments in the field of outer space. But, I would approach this problem from a more fundamental point of view. And within the today's context, I would like to mention three main aspects. Just imagine a triangle. There are three sides. And, just imagine one side is the space traffic management, just generally speaking. The second side of a triangle is the question about the awareness, the space situational awareness. And the third side here is the debris management. And so the national operators, of course, are trying to address these issues. But at the same time, we are living in such a world that an outer space and space have become a unified environment. And so we can't say that there are some orbits alongside which only the satellites of a particular country operate. And that's why we need to come and agree on some unified treaties in this respect. And I agree with what you said about the development of the civil aviation in this respect in the beginning of our session, because currently there are some ideas on how to proceed with this in the field of space within the organizations that are already established in this field. I believe that we should come up with some new treaties and new agreements. And it was absolutely rightly stated there are some fundamental treaties, such as the Outer Space Treaty. As we've seen, there are some references in the treaty that make our operators and those who launch satellites to take into account the interests of other parties. But here, I would also like to draw your attention to the fact that, if we presume that Outer Space Treaty is a constitution for us now, when it was drafted, there was no concept of space traffic management. And when it was being drafted, we didn't think about space debris and about space situational awareness. We didn't think about these aspects at all. And so, in my opinion, I believe that we should establish some new treaties and sign new treaties at the international level. At the same time, we need to remember that the composition of those countries, or a list of those countries that are active in the space, has changed a lot when it comes to their quality and quantity. Now we see the emergence of private companies that are also operating in the space, even though under the control of the government bodies. We need to take into account all these issues. And I believe that we should search for some new forms of our deliberations in this respect. At the same time, I would like to mention that jointly with my colleague, who is also present today, with Chuck Dickey, we are working on the issue of the space debris removal or debris remediation. And the question that you mentioned which was about the safe distance, is also very interesting. We were saying that, well, 8 or 50 kilometers could be an unsafe distance. Perhaps here we should also proceed from the size of the satellites that we are talking about. What we also see, based on the example of our Chinese colleagues, just recently a satellite was removed, a Chinese satellite was removed from the outer space. And on the other hand, there were some concerns voiced because there was a satellite that was removing the debris, and well, somebody said that it could be used for multiple purposes. But somebody from a Space Secure Foundation said that this is the representation of the responsible position of China in this respect. And so, getting back to our question about how to manage space traffic, if we compare it with the road traffic and streets, then perhaps you'll find it difficult to find in cities some vehicles, some automobiles that are out of use, those who are in some accident or incident, and that those that are not operational anymore. All such vehicles are very fast removed from the city. And so the same should be applied to the outer space, because this issue is quite often raised, and more we hear about the necessity to remove those satellites that already worked and that should be removed from the space. I believe that we should we shouldn't forget about the history of this issue. When it comes to the active debris removal, jointly with the Chuck, we've come to a conclusion that we should act here as kind of a Red Cross, the organization that helps the conflicting parties from the humanitarian point of view. So this should be a body that is out of politics at all. In addition to that, perhaps we should create some bodies that will be responsible for the debris removal from an objective point of view. So there should be some intermediary that would help to address these issues without being involved in any particular issues. So when it comes to the question of the space traffic management, I believe that we should proceed from the guiding principles of the sustainable space activities and to establish an international cooperation in this respect. None of the parties, regardless of their activities in the space, has any priority in here and can't do it all alone. Those are my thoughts that I wanted to share with you today. And once again, I'd like to thank you for this opportunity to share my ideas within the Space Cafe. Thank you very much, Valentin. So you mentioned the necessity of adopting international norms. And Alexander, perhaps I would like to address a couple of questions to you. So we have the question from Chuck Dickey. Which platform could be can act as a forum for development of binding rules of the road for avoiding collision in space among maneuverable objects? Are binding rules desirable? This is the first question. And also, should we develop kind of a unified standard for the information, for notification of information, to avoid any misinterpretation? Because, well, the question is, these measures will definitely affect the principle of freedom of space. If we add more regulation, add more rules and standards, then perhaps we will make it more difficult for those countries that has just started to develop their space potential. We will make it more difficult for them to join a so-called space club, because we also mentioned something about freedom and where it ends. It ends where the freedom of another object or subject starts. And so how to address these issues in a sustainable manner? Thank you very much for this question and for the additional question from the Q&A section that you read out. Well, here I believe it's very difficult to say, well, this is right and this is wrong. But, well, perhaps let me start from the question from the chat about the forum. I had some ideas about it, but when I was listening to Vadim Agapov once again, I thought that proceeding from the data, for example, the data that the US has communicated on the official and public website, well, each piece of data can be interpreted differently. We need to establish a unified center for the collection of information and its interpretation. If we don't do that, then, well, we will face some collision in this respect. I believe that this forum should only and can only be the UN platform. It should be a comprehensive one because, well, there is no choice, I believe. We are also working on our article in this respect. And we just mentioned that China refers to Article 5 of the Outer Space Treaty, and they call the group of satellites as a phenomena that is a danger or that poses a risk to their astronauts. And so it's an interesting approach when it comes to the satellite constellations. And perhaps here we could also refer to some military power, etc., etc. And so when we talk about freedom and freedoms, we do understand and we should understand that freedom should be restricted by notion of safety. And we also should take a look at all the treaties as a set of treaties. And still, the Outer Space Treaty should serve and serves as a foundation. And in 2019, the principles and guidelines on the sustainable operations was finalized. And also the US invites everybody to respect it. Yes, this is soft law, but still it was adopted by all the countries. And so I believe that we should proceed from that platform. We should draft up the unified rules. And we do understand that there is a military sector in any country, be that China, US, or Russia. And also, when we draw the parallel between civil aviation and space, once again, we mention only civil aviation, not military aviation, and the same applies to space. And of course, those countries that are just willing to go to outer space, it will be very difficult to do it for them if we have large amounts of debris, as well as if we don't regulate our space activities. Yes, thank you very much. But Vladimir, we know that the discussion about it takes place not only on the official forums and platforms, but also within the NGOs, such as the International Academy of Astronautics and many others. Could you please tell us more about the work of these groups? What were the main issues that were discussed? Are there any possible solutions to this? And what practical results do you see in this respect? I'll be very happy to share the information on how the work in the NGO sector takes place. But before that, I'd like to share a couple of my ideas regarding the questions about the freedom in space. Well, I believe everybody knows and understands that even when it comes to the Outer Space Treaty and the freedom of exploration and use of outer space, there are actually two large groups of lawyers that interpret this phrase as a freedom of activities in the space. This is something that is not recognized in Russia. So the freedom of exploration and use of outer space for research isn't similar to the freedom of activity. And I would like once again to speak the language of the road traffic. Everybody who got the driving license is free to drive across the roads if there are no bans or any signs. But these people are not free on the road because some activities can increase the risk of a collision, of an accident. For example, when we constantly change lanes on the road, it is a risk. And so there is no freedom of activity even on a motor road. So the drivers are free to move according to the rules. But they're not just free in their movement at all without any restrictions. And the same can be said about the civil aviation. And when we talk about space, well, it seems that space is a very large environment, but at the same time, I believe that lawyers, I'm not a lawyer, I'm an engineer, but still, I talk a lot to lawyers within my work. I participate in a lot of discussions, and I do understand that sometimes there can be kind of a misunderstanding between lawyers and engineers when it comes to the interpretation of some same notions. And one of this notion or essence or issue is the balance between freedom and safety. We need to strike it. And another idea of mine, I already mentioned the idea that we need to get a more accurate and precise information in the field of space. Let's just imagine that the whole humanity managed to identify the location of any space object at any point of time with an arrow that will not be bigger than the size of a space object, of a satellite. So we will get rid of a lot of concerns in here because everybody is identified. There are no problems. And when we don't have this, then of course there could be a mistake that will be very dangerous. Currently, we are talking about thousands, tens of thousands of satellites and space objects in the space. And if it turns out that the information that describes the location of a space object in the environment is not accurate, then we will not be able to make a decision at all, because we will always face the problem of uncertainty and inaccuracy. So my main idea, and actually this topic is discussed over different NGO platforms, on how to communicate this difficult paradigm, how to communicate these issues to the decision makers, to the leaders, because we do understand that it's difficult to expect that they understand all these aspects very deeply. And secondly, we also need to take into account that there are just few states and international NGOs in the world that can really track and monitor of what is going on in the space. And we have about 70 space players, so to say, and this problem needs to be addressed. And I do understand that one of the solutions could be a discussion and establishment on the basis of a consensus of an international information center that will monitor the dangerous situations in the space. And this was initiated by the Russian Federation during the talks on the development of guiding principles in the field of sustainable space activity. But unfortunately, this initiative hasn't gained any support yet for different reasons. But I don't see any other option in here. We all need to agree first on which information to use, what are the requirements towards this information and data. Thirdly, how should it be interpreted? And fourthly, how and when should it be used? Because the question that we got in the chat is a very good one. Should we focus on the prevention of collisions and maneuvering of space objects? Well, I don't think so, because what is the difference whether two maneuvering space objects collide or two space debris objects collide? Because in any case, if any collision takes place, then a lot of debris will be generated once again. The debris will be just multiplied. And so that is the issue that raised and resulted in a lot of discussions of the space traffic management. Because when we talk about the civil aviation traffic management, the road traffic management, the sea or maritime traffic management, here we are talking about controlled objects in 99% of the cases. But when we talk about the space and coordination in the field of space, then we need to understand that the number, the proportion of controlled objects is just a couple of percent out of all objects that pose risks. 95% of the space objects that could pose a risk is 95%. And so we can't command them, we can't control them from the Earth in the traditional sense. And I believe that we should develop indeed some comprehensive measures that will take into account this particular feature. This question is far from being a trivial one or a simple one from the political, legal, and technical points of view. So this is a whole set of issues that are discussed on different non-governmental platforms and forums. And currently there is a work underway between the International Astronautics Association as well as International Academy of Astronautics and the International Institute of Space Law. There is a work underway to develop some expert propositions to lay the foundation for some legal documents, some framework that will be applicable at both national and international levels. And without the discussion of all these aspects, both technical and legal, as well as the capacity and competences, as well as technical capacities of different states, all this should be taken into account. Thank you. Thank you for your very interesting opinion. We are very much pressed for time, and perhaps I'll have some concluding question. Let's just dream. Let's dream about an ideal system of space traffic management. You've already mentioned a couple of cases when objects either can perform some maneuvering or cannot, and it's evident who should avoid the collision in this case, because safety comes first. Any maneuvering, if it's a capacity of both objects, it all results, for example, in the fuel consumption as well as in switching on of the electric propulsion system. So it all incurs some expenses. And how should all it be managed? For example, today I should maneuver if I can, and tomorrow you should maneuver if you can. Or somehow the reimbursement should be prescribed. Perhaps it's evident for all of us that the priority here should lay within the piloted, controlled missions. So what are the ideal items of this ideal picture of space traffic management? Valentin, if you could start, I'd be very grateful. Okay, thank you. Talking about an ideal dream picture, it's inaccessible because, well, there should be no risks at all, which is not possible. Ideally, we should start our work. We should unite the resources of different countries and provide access to these resources. There are two aspects that should be addressed, be that within the work of an international organization or some body that could perform these tasks, it doesn't matter. But Vladimir was absolutely right in saying that technical professionals understand these issues. Lawyers take a look at all of it from their own perspective. And I would like to set or to mention the following case. I believe that actually currently NGO platforms are already discussing these issues. When it comes to space debris, there is a work guided by Brian McKnight, and the work says that scientists already understand which space objects pose the most risk. Now we should move away from understanding it from the technical point of view and come closer to the legal point of view. And so currently we have a special project on that, and we would like to approach to the ideal picture in this respect. We conducted a workshop on the basis of the International Institute of Space Law. Then we used the platform of the Russian Council on International Affairs, and we initiated the discussion, a comprehensive discussion of questions involving those scientists that are working with the problems of dangerous objects. We should also be involving those scientists that are working in the field of economy and expenses. And in this respect, I would suggest the following. We need to think of options. I believe that we should establish a government-private partnership at the international level. Perhaps we can establish some body that will not act as an international organization in the classical sense, but perhaps we can ask or hire some organization that could address the issue of space debris and space traffic management. And so I would like to use this opportunity and say that if my colleagues are interested in the workshop that I mentioned on the platform of the Russian Council of International Affairs, the topic is the political and other aspects of the active debris removal. You can approach me, you can contact me. I'll be very happy to discuss it because this is a non-governmental expert platform that we are currently creating. Unfortunately, we are not receiving any sound from the speaker. We'll wait for the sound to come back.
Простите, пожалуйста, меня папа позвал.
Владимир Михайлович, если
Vladimir,
связь стабильна, можно узнать ваше мнение.
I hope our connection with you is stable, so could you please comment on that issue? It would be very nice, and also we would appreciate it very much if we could answer another question from our chat. How do we monitor and identify small debris objects in the space? Yes, okay, so I would like to first answer the question of who should avoid the collision the first. First and foremost, both parties should receive the information on the willingness of maneuvering from the other party if we have two maneuvering satellites. Let's just imagine that I'm an operator of some satellite. I receive some information and it says that there is nobody around me. But at the same time, there could be another satellite next to me. It is a controlled, piloted satellite. It's next to me, but I don't know about it. And so how do I understand that I pose a risk to somebody else if I'm not notified that somebody else is next to me? Just imagine I can maneuver my satellite and just imagine I'm on the trajectory of the second satellite, and this second satellite can't respond to my maneuvering. I would say that, well, I lacked the information and the collision happened. And the second party can say that I was acting on purpose to avoid this kind of a collision and a situation, to address all these issues. We can follow the same approach that was taken at ICAO. When we have two civil aircrafts and they proceed from the data that they read on their dashboards. That's how crews receive the information that there is a risk of an unsafe distance. In this respect, both civil aircrafts should maneuver to the right. This is the rule. But for this, both should receive on their dashboard the information that such situation is possible, that there is a risk. Unfortunately, this is not completely possible in the space, but we can work on it. In Russia, we referred to an agreement, to a treaty on the prevention of incidents in the world ocean between Russia and the US. And there's also some text about the prevention of collisions of ships, including military ships. So what I mean is there are some rules in some other industries and sections. Definitely, we cannot just copy these rules and paste it in the space activities, in the space traffic. Of course, there are different rules and laws of movement, and we are talking about absolutely different time framework. Unfortunately, satellites, despite all the movies in Hollywood, cannot avoid collision in 1 or 2 or several seconds because of the energy system, specific one. And to prevent a collision, we need at least a couple of hours in the space. So we are talking different timeline. And here, of course, we need to proceed from the information. Secondly, how to monitor small space objects. And of course, this is the question of liability. When it comes to large space objects, which are more than 10 centimeters in our understanding, usually, not always, but usually, we can use some specific mathematical methods and we can establish the source from which they are coming. And we can establish the chain of events due to which an object was formed. And we can identify which state could be called a launching one for this particular object, which is larger than 10 centimeters. But when it comes to very small objects, which are less than 10 centimeters, in 90% of cases, this task cannot be addressed in the same manner. Why? Because the majority of these objects were formed over the course of the last 60 or 70 years of our space activities because of some activities in the space orbit, disintegrations. Unfortunately, they were not identified immediately. Now we identify more and more such objects, but we cannot do the reverse sourcing. We cannot identify from which states, from which objects these tiny objects were formed. So we need to agree now on those objects that can take part in the space incidents, but regarding which we cannot identify what is the source of this object and which state or government can be liable for that. And we also discussed it within the work on the sustainable space activity. But this issue is a very difficult and comprehensive one, technically and legally speaking. The issue was postponed. It was under review, but we didn't adopt it. We didn't agree on that. And we will continue to discuss this issue within the Space Committee. But I believe that we need to involve a wider expert community to discuss this very, very difficult issue. Without it, one cannot talk about a liability and responsibility in a wider sense. I don't see any meaning in that. Thank you very much, dear speakers, for your valuable knowledge, for the very interesting discussion. We are quite beyond our time frame, but I believe that it was useful and enriching, mutually enriching for us. And Alexander, if you could share the article which you are working on the issue of US and China situation, we will appreciate it very much. So, dear participants, thank you very much for your participation. I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll be very happy to meet you over our next sessions. Our next Space Café Russia will be live on the 1st of April, and please follow our updates.
Thank you so much for this very interesting talk, and I'm very happy that this was now a Space Café Russia that I could also follow. So thank you, Dana. before we finish for today, I do want to go through our next upcoming events because there's some great ones. So on the 8th of February, we have our next 33 minutes with Dr. Nanja Strecker from ESA BIC Switzerland on accelerating the Swiss space ecosystem. Then 2 days later, on the 10th of February, we have two great events. So we have another panel organized by the Space Arbitration Association by Laura Zelensky, which is looking into the question, is there a need for an institution specialized in space disputes? Also on the 10th of February, we have our next Moriba's Vox Populi, where Moriba and his great panel of experts will tackle the question, what will it take for humanity to take action on space environmentalism? On the 14th of February, we will have our very next Space Café Brazil by Ian Grossner, which will be in Portuguese. And on the 15th of February, we have our 33 minutes with Ron Livna from the Roman Foundation in Israel about the upcoming Reika mission with Axiom. All our events are going to be online on Eventbrite. As always, we love to hear your feedback, so please check in with us on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Don't forget to sign up for our daily and our bi-weekly newsletters. And if you want to treat yourselves to something special, become a Space Watcher today or help us in the supporter program. Thank you to Elina, Vladimir, Valentin, and Alexander for this inspiring talk and for sharing your knowledge, for being our guests today. A huge thank you also to Anna for the great translation. It was really amazing. And thanks to the entire team behind the scenes for doing that great job week in and week out. So I hope you all stay safe and stay healthy. Thanks again for joining us and for being so active in the chat and in the Q&A section. I hope to see you in the next weeks. And in the meantime, don't forget to visit our website and follow us on social media. And don't forget, become a Space Watcher. Thank you so, so much.